The day after Resurrection Sunday, Vatican authorities announced the death of Pope Francis at the age of 88. The Pope was suffering from a number of health issues and had been hospitalized on February the 14th. He did appear yesterday in public. Now, the Vatican and the Catholic Church at large have entered its traditional phase of mourning for the late pontiff. But many are wondering what direction the Church will go in the selection of the next pope, and what is the future of the Catholic Church on some of the controversial issues that the Pope Francis he wasn't real clear on, did not provide the direction that many were looking for. Here to discuss this, Eric Sammons, editor-in-chief of Crisis Magazine and the author of 7 books, including Deadly Indifference, How the Church Lost Her Mission and How We Can Reclaim It. Eric, welcome back to Washington Watch. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me, Tony. I appreciate you bringing me on.
Well, I certainly think that this is a place where many in the Catholic Church are going to be mourning the passing of any pope. That's obviously a very significant position of leadership in the Church. But there was a lot of controversy surrounding his tenure as pope on some of those core issues that obviously we deal with a lot when it comes to public policy, life, marriage, family, human sexuality. What do you see the reaction being long-term to his tenure as pope?
I think the word you used previously, which was confusion, is a good one. Because the fact is, if you really look, and I've done this, you study what Pope Francis has said and done over the years, he has said some very good things on issues like abortion, same-sex marriage, issues of that nature, and transgenderism. However, he's also done things that undermine those statements, frankly, that make it appear that, he has welcomed pro-abortion politicians with open arms. He has, there was a document that the Vatican released a couple years ago that allowed the blessing of same-sex couples, things of that nature he's done. And it honestly has caused confusion among Catholics, on Christians, all men and women of goodwill, about what exactly is the Church teaching. Those of us who are Catholic know the Church has very clear teachings, official teachings, against abortion, against homosexuality, against transgenderism. But at times, the Pope, by his actions, Pope Francis, by his actions, didn't always make that clear what the Church's teaching were. And I think that will be a legacy, an unfortunate legacy of his pontificate, is that although, like I said, he said good things many times on these issues, other times he just didn't really act in a way that made it clear that that's exactly what the Church teaches.
Yeah, Eric, I think that's a very important delineation, because the Church teachings didn't change. It was the way he talked about some of them in creating that confusion. I had the opportunity to go to the Vatican a number of years ago for a conference on the complementarian nature of man and woman. This was before the redefinition of marriage. But you're right. The teachings there, the documents are very clear, but his statements muddled it. Do you see as the cardinals gather together and they'll be choosing a new leader of the Church, a new pope, will that be a part of the thinking?
I do think so. I think because there's 2 different aspects when you talk about who the Pope's going to be, who they might want. One is going to be, yes, what is this person's ideology, so to speak, to use kind of a political term, but what's their theology? How do they really look at these issues, all the issues that Christians and all Catholics must address? But also, what's their governance style? What's their public relations style, to use that term? Because I think in the first area, I think in general, the cardinals will be in general agreement on what is believed, what should be taught. And then the real question will be, okay, what kind of governance do we want? Do we want a pope who's going to be very much out in the world, like a Pope John Paul II? Or do we want maybe a more intellectual pope, like a Pope Benedict XVI? Do we want somebody like Francis? I personally think they're not going to want somebody who's the same style as Francis. Maybe some of the same thoughts and ideas of Francis, but not the same style. So all these things will come together when the cardinals meet in the conclave to say, okay, what different factors are most important to us? Some bishops might be, like, honestly, the cardinals coming from America and a lot of Western Europe, they're going to be more concerned about let's be honest, a more progressive ideology. But then you're going to get some of the cardinals who are coming from Africa, Asia, the Middle East, places like that. And they're not as concerned about the issues that are as important to maybe the Western Europeans, like homosexuality and abortion. They just consider that a done deal. They're not like still stuck in the 60s and 70s about that. And so they're more concerned about church growth, for example, in Africa, in Latin America, places like that.
You mentioned Pope John Paul. The world was a very volatile place back there during the Cold War. He, working with Ronald Reagan, as we now know history very clearly, Margaret Thatcher, played a key role in bringing down the wall and opening up Eastern Europe. You know, we're once again at a very volatile time. The United States has a leader along the lines of Ronald Reagan. Might that factor into to their decision when you look at the geopolitical landscape of the world?
I think so. I hope so, honestly. I mean, the great thing about Pope John Paul II is there were two great evils in the world at the time that he had to face. One was, of course, the threat of communism in the East and that destructive whole ideology. But then in the West, there was that growing culture of death, with abortion, euthanasia, things like that. And one of the beauties of John Paul II is he worked against both. And he, like you say, he worked with Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher. Today we have some great evils of globalism. We have also the great evil of like the woke ideology, the idea of just changing reality, trying to use different words to say what reality is. So what I'm praying for and hoping for is a pope who recognizes those two great threats, and like John Paul II, will stand up to them, because I do think that's a failing of Pope Francis. He was not always clear against those two threats, and he seemed to sometimes cozy up to the people who were for that. Maybe, I think, with good intentions a lot of times, but ultimately, I think it should have been more the John Paul II method of we have to fight against these evils. And so what I'm hopeful for is the Cardinals will see that as a need. Like I said, I'm not real confident the Cardinals coming from America necessarily, but I do think, like, for example, the Cardinals coming from Africa and Asia, they see that more clearly, the evils of globalism, of the ideology. I mean, like we know, American aid for so many years in Africa was dependent upon you had to abide by all this progressive ideology. And so that's something that the African Cardinals are directly aware of. So I'm hopeful they'll say, okay, new administration in America, maybe this won't be the case anymore. We can work with that administration.
Eric, we just got a couple minutes left now. I want to get the process, but first, before we do that, you mentioned Africa, you mentioned threats. Where does Islam factor into that, radical Islam?
Yeah, I think that's something that's very interesting, because one of the candidates that people think might be very likely to be elected pope is Cardinal Pizzaballa, who is the Latin Patriarch of Jerusalem, and he is directly involved with protecting one of his biggest priorities is protecting Middle Eastern Christians from what's going on in Gaza and throughout that area. And so I think that's somebody who's very aware of the threat of Islam there, of the different threats in the Middle East. There's also a cardinal from Iraq, and so he's surrounded, by Islam. So I think there are more cardinals aware of kind of the geopolitical role that Islam has in the world.
I certainly hope that the Catholic Church will be a strong voice for religious freedom and add their voice to, I think that's a very significant growing threat. All right, Eric, we just have a minute and a half left. Process. What's the timeline? What's this look like?
So what first happens is there's a period of mourning, and then for Pope Francis, there will be his funeral. They haven't set the exact dates or anything like that, but typically it's about 9 days of mourning, and then soon after that will be the conclave. My guess is in about 2 weeks from now is when the conclave will start. That could last a very short time or a very long time. There have literally been conclaves that have lasted years. Now, I don't think that's going to happen in modern times, as cardinals are going to get out of there before that. But it could last weeks. Usually in modern times, conclaves usually last a few days. And my guess is that'll happen. The first few votes will just be a matter of, okay, who are the main candidates? And then people start working, the cardinals start working together, say, okay, we'll compromise and we won't go with our guy, but we'll go with your guy if we kind of all get together. And so my guess is we're talking about 2 weeks from now, the conclave will start. and then within a few days, God willing, we'll get a new pope.
And how many cardinals will be in that meeting?
About 140.
All right. Eric, thanks so much for joining us today. Very insightful. Appreciate the conversation.
Thank you very much, Tony, for having me on.